The date is April 26, 1986, and the city of Pripyat is sleeping under a warm spring sky. It was a city of the future built to show the world the glory of Soviet nuclear power. But just 3 kilometers away inside the control room of Unit 4 of the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, a group of tired men were about to trigger the most expensive and deadly glitch in human history. Welcome to another episode of History Glitch, where we explore the moment humanity's arrogance collided with the laws of physics. Based on the masterpiece Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham today, we are going to dissect the catastrophe that changed the world. To understand the true horror of Chernobyl, you have to understand the irony at its heart. The explosion did not happen during a war or a terrorist attack. It happened during a safety test. That is the ultimate glitch. They blew up the reactor while trying to prove how safe it was. The test was designed to fix a potential problem with the turbines. If the power went out, there was a 60-second gap before the diesel backup generators kicked in. During that minute, the cooling pumps would stop working, which could lead to a meltdown. The engineers wanted to see if the spinning momentum of the dying turbine could generate enough electricity to bridge that gap. It was a simple experiment on paper, but in the Soviet Union, nothing was simple. The test was originally scheduled for the day shift on April 25th. The day shift crew was experienced and knew the reactor well. But then the first glitch occurred. A grid controller in Kiev called the plant and delayed the test because factories needed electricity. The reactor was kept at half power for hours, poisoning it with invisible byproducts. By the time they finally got permission to proceed, it was late at night. The experienced day shift had gone home. The night shift was walking in. These were young men led by Leonid Toptonov, who was only 26 years old. His supervisor was Alexander Akimov, who was smart but afraid of authority. And the man in charge of them all was the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov. In Higginbotham's book, Dyatlov is painted as a bully who demanded absolute obedience. He was tired, irritable, and just wanted to get this test over with. The reactor they were operating, the RBMK 1000, was a beast. It was massive and powerful, but it had a fatal design flaw that was considered a state secret. It was unstable at low power. As the night shift began, Toptonov made a mistake. He didn't enter the command to hold the power correctly, and the reactivity plummeted. The reactor almost shut itself down. This triggered something called xenon poisoning. Xenon 135 is a byproduct of nuclear fission that absorbs neutrons like a sponge, acting like a brake. The safe operating procedure was clear: shut it down, wait 24 hours, and start again. But Dyatlov didn't want to wait. He ordered the young operators to pull the control rods out to force the power back up. The operators hesitated, knowing it was dangerous, but in the Soviet system, you did not say no to your boss. They began to pull the rods out one by one. To get the power up, they removed almost every single control rod from the core, leaving only a handful inserted. They were manually fighting the xenon poisoning, stripping the reactor of its brakes. They managed to stabilize the power, but the reactor was now in a precarious state, a ticking bomb primed to explode. At 1:23:04 a.m., the test began. They closed the steam valves to the turbines. The water pumps slowed down. As the water flow decreased, the water in the core began to boil. Now we come to the second fatal flaw of the RBMK reactor, the positive void coefficient. In most Western reactors, if the water boils, the reaction slows down. But in this Soviet design, the opposite happens. When water turns to steam, the reaction speeds up. As the water boiled away, the power began to rise fast. Toptonov shouted that the power was surging. Akimov realized they had lost control. He shouted, "Engage the AZ-5 button." The AZ-5 was the emergency scram button, the ultimate failsafe. When pressed, it was supposed to drive all the control rods back into the core simultaneously and stop the reaction in seconds. At 1:23:40 a.m., Akimov pressed the button. And this is the most terrifying glitch of all. The button that was supposed to save them was the trigger that killed them. The control rods were made of boron, which stops the reaction, but the tips of the rods were made of graphite. Graphite does not stop the reaction, it accelerates it. The designers had done this to save money, but they had unknowingly created a detonator. When the rods began to descend, those graphite tips entered the already unstable supercharged core first. Instead of shutting it down, they caused a massive localized spike in reactivity at the bottom of the reactor. The power didn't stop, it skyrocketed. It went from 200 megawatts to over 30,000 megawatts in a fraction of a second. The heat was so intense that the fuel pellets shattered. The channels holding the control rods warped and broke. The rods got stuck halfway in. The brakes were jammed. At 1:23:58 a.m., the 1,000-ton concrete lid of the reactor was thrown into the air like a coin. The first explosion tore the building apart. Oxygen rushed in, mixing with the hydrogen and graphite, causing a second, even bigger explosion. The roof of the reactor hall was obliterated. Inside the control room, the walls shook. Dust fell from the ceiling and the lights went out. The men didn't know it yet, but they were standing in the middle of an open nuclear volcano. Their first reaction was denial. It was psychologically impossible for them to believe the reactor had exploded. Akimov and Dyatlov believed a tank had exploded. Akimov, in a tragic act of heroism, stayed behind with his crew to manually pump water into the reactor. They were wading through radioactive water, their skin turning brown from the nuclear tan pumping water into a crater that didn't exist anymore. Outside, the scene was apocalyptic. Firefighters arrived within minutes with no special gear. They saw chunks of smooth black mineral on the ground. One firefighter picked a piece up. It was warm and greasy. It was solid graphite from the reactor core, emitting enough radiation to kill a man in minutes. He didn't know what it was. He kicked it aside. Within an hour, the firefighters began to vomit and collapse as their nervous systems shut down. Back in the plant, the denial continued all the way to the top. The plant director, Viktor Bryakonov, was woken up and informed of an accident. He drove to the plant and saw the devastation, but his mind refused to accept the scale of it. He relied on a small radiometer that maxed out at 3.6 roentgens per hour. He didn't know that the real levels were 15,000 roentgens. It was like measuring the distance to the moon with a ruler and saying it is only 12 inches away because that is where the ruler ends. As the sun rose over Pripyat on Saturday morning, the city woke up to a beautiful warm day. Children played in the sandboxes. Families went to the river. But there was a metallic taste in the air. The pine forest near the plant was turning a rusty red color as the trees died from radiation. The air itself seemed to glow. Yet there was no announcement. No warning. The glitch was not just in the machine, it was in the system. The Soviet state could not admit failure. They kept the city of 50,000 people living next to a spewing volcano for 36 hours before finally ordering an evacuation. By then it was too late for many. The radioactive cloud had already drifted over Europe, triggering alarms in Sweden nearly 1,000 miles away. The world found out about Chernobyl not because the Soviets told them, but because Swedish nuclear workers detected radiation on their own shoes. In the end, thousands of men called liquidators were sent in to clean up the mess, shoveling radioactive graphite off the roof by hand because the robots kept failing due to the radiation. Adam Higginbotham's book makes it clear that Chernobyl was not just an accident. It was the inevitable result of a culture of secrecy and lies. The operators made mistakes, yes, but they were holding a loaded gun that was designed to go off. The RBMK reactor was a glitch waiting to happen. The cost of this glitch was the lives of thousands, the permanent contamination of a massive landmass, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. It serves as a grim reminder that you can lie to your bosses, you can lie to the press, and you can lie to the people, but you cannot lie to the atom.